I'm looking at a beautiful picture while I'm sitting here. So thank you, Rose Marie, for being here and presenting this. I am Sarah Kessinger. I'm president of the Sterling Society, which is the host to the Coffee and Conversation series with the artist. And we do have a sponsor. The sponsor is Diane Wheatley Gelati, and it is just wonderful that she has done this for us, because during our really bad times when we were all, we not only had to do Zoom, we didn't have another thing else in the world to do. She was there to help us, and we were able to join Zoom and pay for Zoom and help, get as much help as we could get to be able to do everything during the wonderful COVID times. But just wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And I will just say, Diane, thank you for doing this. And Rose Marie, thank you. And let's move on. Go for it, Diane.
Okay, and I see that Rachel Stewart has her hand up. Rachel, if you want to unmute yourself briefly before we kick off the presentation, and I'll take a few moments right now just to explain the logistics of this. Typically, we ask people to type their questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and then we allow time at the end for questions and answers. So when Rose Marie is speaking, it's good if everybody is muted so that none of the background noise in your home is heard during her presentation. But Rachel, do you have a specific question? Can you not hear us? If you can't hear us, there, okay.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I can hear everything. I'm just trying to navigate through this whole thing. So I'm sorry.
That's okay. So as I just mentioned then, for any of you folks we're now up to almost 40 people registered on the site, 67 total registered, but we're going to kick it off. And I know you've all read the information on the DFAC website about Rose Marie Prins. She's an award-winning artist, mixed media, sculptor, painter, and an educator. And I'm not going to go into all of the information that you've read about the numerous exhibits, both international and throughout the US. Instead, I will just let Rose Marie kick it off, explain the nature of this first painting, which I love, and I got the background from her the other day when we did a practice. So Rose Marie, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Diane, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I am looking at this painting, a watercolor done by my father. For those of you who know my art, it's nothing like what I do, but it does touch me to see this because my father was an artist, as you can see, and he is the person who encouraged me and supported me very early on in my career. In fact, from second grade on. So thank you, Daddy, wherever you are. And of course, this is a painting done in South Africa. It's a scene in the Transvaal. I grew up in the Transvaal in the big city of Johannesburg. And when I was 16, I left high school and I went to art school, thanks to, again, the support of my parents. And I studied to become a graphic artist because my father owned an ad agency. And what do you do if you're an artist? You go into advertising, I thought. And so I worked in ad agencies and newspapers in Johannesburg, London, Toronto, Santa Fe, Los Angeles, and there are probably some others there too, until I decided I really didn't want to do this anymore. And I went back to art school and I went to the San Francisco Art Institute, which was heaven. This is a photograph by Maggie Bacon, but this to me was absolute heaven. And there I studied painting. I got a Bachelor's of Fine Arts degree in painting. And just about the time I was due to graduate, I got pregnant and had a baby. But I'll tell you more about that later. So in this screen, I am doing a performance at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. After I left this San Francisco Art Institute, I became a student at the Women's Building in Los Angeles, and Suzanne Lacey was my mentor, and she was a performance artist. She still is, very well-known performance artist. And so that was an influence, and I became, for a short while, I did some performances and became a performance artist. So this was a performance that I did, as I said, at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, and it's called Sacrifice of the Sun, and I am playing the role of the goddess Inanna. Now, of course, the Women's Building is a staunchly feminist, or was a staunchly feminist organization, and I have always been a devout feminist, and so I've also been very interested in the goddess movement. So here I am as Inanna, performing the Sacrifice of the Sun. The inspiration for that performance was a dream I had of a tree with fish at the end of its branches instead of leaves. And it was a very vivid dream, and I decided I had to find out all about that symbolism. So I studied this symbolism of the tree, of course, the tree of life, and the fish. And of course, this fish we know is a symbol for Christianity, but long before the days of Christianity, it was a symbol for the feminine, for feminine sexuality, and for fertility. And apparently, according to the myth, Inanna sacrificed her son Tammuz each year in the fall, at the time when the wheat was harvested. And so this was the performance that I did around that myth. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a woman with long hair walking through the crowd, and she is actually handing out fish. We served fish as part of the performance. The health folks wouldn't allow you to do that these days, but we could do it back in those days. So that was my dabbling in performance art. It wasn't until I arrived in New Mexico that I really found my mature voice as an artist. I fell in love with New Mexico. And what you see here is the Pedernal. That is a mountain that George O'Keeffe said, God said, if I painted often enough, I could have it. And I was fortunate to live in El Rancho. Most of the time I was in New Mexico, near Santa Fe and not too far from Abiquiu. I've been introduced as an educator, so I'm going to briefly talk about myself as an educator before I move on to talk about my own art. I have taught, I have to look at my list because it's long, but I have taught in a youth detention center as an artist in residence. I became an artist in residence with the New Mexico Arts Division very shortly after I arrived in New Mexico. So I taught in the YDDC in Albuquerque and on an Indian reservation and the Women's State Penitentiary. And I've also taught people with disabilities through, it's called Arts for All now. And I also taught in schools K through 12. I got my California teaching credentials, K through 12. And I have, of course, taught in colleges and universities throughout the Tampa Bay area, Ringling College of Art and Design, Eckerd College, Hillsborough Community College, and Barry University, teaching painting, sculpture, art appreciation, drawing. So I currently teach at the Maureen Arts Center, and I teach privately on Zoom. So if you want to know more about my teaching experience, you can go on my website, rosemarieprins.com. You can look at my blog and you'll see lots of information about that. But I am going to show you one piece that was a collaboration between the high school students at Pewaukee High and me. And it's called I'll Whip You and Waste You Away. In New Mexico, when I lived there was a very controversial issue, the waste isolation pilot project. The government, wanted to cart radioactive waste past Pewaukee High School in order to deliver it to a place near the Carlsbad Caverns, so to sink it deep in the earth. And some of the students objected to that, to the risks involved in carting radioactive waste. And so they participated with me in this installation, which was, I'll whip you and waste you away. Okay, that's the title they gave it. We entered it into a professional competition for professional artists, Art Windows on Route 66, and it won honorable mention. So you see, I found these bones as I walked around the desert in New Mexico, and they strung them all together with wire. And then we found a rusty wheelbarrow and more bones, and we put sand on the floor. And this was the character that was going to whip you and waste you away, life-size character. And this is in one of the store windows on Route 66. And then that same installation went to Santa Fe. It was in Artists Against WIP, and it was shown at the Center for Contemporary Arts in Santa Fe. And moving on now to my own art, very shortly after I arrived in New Mexico, I created an installation called Sati, Mars, and the Bomb, a Trinity. So I became a devout yogi early in my 20s. I've been doing hatha yoga all my life. But after I arrived in New Mexico, I became very involved in the spiritual aspect of yoga, the philosophical aspect of yoga, meditation. And what puzzled me was how a path that had originated in India and was so beautiful could also have spawned this horrible rite of sati. And by the way, sati is an anglicization of sati, S-A-T-I. But Sati was the Hindu god's wife who was supposed to have burnt herself alive, self-immolation. And that is a metaphor, as I understand it, for the beautiful practice of burning your ego in the fire of spiritual practice. But of course, in a patriarchal society, that became perverted. And so we had sati, the throwing of widows onto their husbands' funeral pyres, burning them alive. And we in New Mexico, during that period of time, were also, particularly me living near Los Alamos, where the nuclear bomb was developed, were also very aware of this ominous mushroom cloud that spread above us. Not literally, of course, we'd all be dead, but metaphorically. This is where the nuclear bomb was developed. Trinity, that's why we have Trinity in this title. Trinity sites is where the nuclear bomb was first detonated. That's where the experiments took place, not far from where I lived in New Mexico. So then we also have moths, which of course are insects, which because of an evolutionary failure to adapt, I'm simplifying here, fly into the flame. So here I'm creating a parallel among sati, moths, and the bomb, a trinity. And this is the installation. I'm showing you details. This is a preparatory drawing I did, Conte on paper. So the plan was to have a huge candle, 5-foot tall candle, and about 30 odd moths dangling around it, and to have soundtracks on either side of the candle coming out from the walls of the gallery. One would be an excerpt from a Hindu text that talks about the ideal wife as one who throws herself on her husband's funeral pyre. And on the other side, there was a poem that I wrote, which ends with, they whirl their dervish dance to a fiery oblivion, the moths. So these are some modern prints that I did around that theme. And then these are some of the moth-like objects I made using handmade paper and seeds and various materials to stabilize the handmade paper. This is Roplex. And the bones are all found on the desert. I would just wander around the mesas and pick up bones and incorporate those into these moth-like objects. And they vary in size from about maybe 2 foot tall to about 6 inches high, 2 foot high to 6 inches. So there's another one. I'm only showing you a few. This, of course, is a cuttle shell with handmade paper and straw. And this is a styrofoam cup with wax on it and a skull, tiny. Handmade paper in bone. And that's the other side of that one. And these are made with resin and found object. And this one is, it's corrugated cardboard, but it's actually handmade paper molded on corrugated cardboard and found object. So there are about 30 of those, and I'm going to show you more because those come out of their mothballs every once in a while and get incorporated into other installations. But this is a very, unfortunately, those are the days when we had slides, and then I had to scan the slides, and so it's not, some of these images aren't great, but here is the 5-foot candle and some of the 30-odd moth-like objects that were dangling around the candle, hanging from the ceiling, with the soundtracks coming to us from either side of the room, of the gallery. This is shown, it has been shown in Santa Fe and Los Angeles and Montana, Atlanta, here in St. Petersburg. And so it's done the rounds. Again, while I was in New Mexico, again, as a devout feminist, I was very interested in, as I said, the goddess movement, and also very interested in Jungian psychology, what those ancient Greek myths mean to us contemporary, in our contemporary world. And so I created an installation called In the Realm of Aphrodite, and not just an installation, it was a series of works, paintings, drawings, sculpture, all around the myths of Aphrodite. And so this is the birth of Aphrodite. We all know the famous painting, The Birth of Aphrodite, how she emerges from the ocean, she emerges from the foam. And so this is my painting. In mixed media, almost all my work is mixed media. Large piece, 77 by 43. And nigredo. Nigredo is another word in alchemy for the darkness, the dark side. And you'll see that these all have triangles on them, and I'll explain the triangle in a moment. This is a piece, Eros's wound. So of course, Eros is the god who flew into the sun and burned his wings. So of course was wounded. So I took sometimes I slash my canvases, sometimes I take a blowtorch, sometimes I take acid, but often I'll slash the canvas in some way or other, or rip it in some way or other. And then I have to mend the wound. It's a metaphor for the human condition, of course. We're all wounded, and then we work to become whole as part of our evolution, as part of our self-examination. And so this piece is literally bonded together with Bondo, Eros's wound, also made in part with soil from the New Mexico desert. This was the beginning of that process for me of using soil in my work. I left the canvas out over the winter, and the soil attached itself to the canvas. This is a sculpture made with found objects. Actually, it's a mobile, but made with found objects and resin. Aphrodite and Hephaestus. And Hephaestus, for those of you who know your Greek myths, was the husband of Aphrodite. And he was a god who had a disability. So it's good to know that even gods can have disabilities. Oracle. I have been in Greece, and Greece is a country that I totally fell in love with, and particularly loved Delphi, where of course the ancient oracle was. And so this piece is called Oracle. Again, it's a mobile. It's made with resin and a found object, which is a gourd, and painted. And you have the measurements there. I have measurements for most of my pieces here, but not the materials. I can tell you what the materials are, and most of the time I do know the measurements, but not always. So this is a couple of pieces from that same series. And again, you're probably wondering why this feminine symbol, which we normally see this way, the triangle, is in all of these images this way. And that is because the triangle facing this way in Hindu law is the yoni that faces the sacrificial altar. So, of course, there's the lingam and yoni in Hindu mythology, and the lingam symbolizes the male, the yoni symbolizes the female, and the yoni that faces the sacrificial altar is this way. So obviously there's an element, an interest in sacrifice that's been a thread through my work. It's not at all about literal sacrifice. It's all about sacrificing the ego to something higher. So these are two pieces, Eros and Aphrodite. Eros was the son of Aphrodite, if I'm remembering correctly. And this is a work on, the one on the right is a work on paper with tape and charcoal and wax and some other mixed medium. I also was working in monotypes. This is a monotype with mixed media, or oil stick actually in this case. Again, the same triangle. Now, when I get hold of a symbol, I really work it, as those of you who are familiar with my recent leaf series will know. So yes, I was really totally involved in the symbol of the triangle, working it with all different media. This is another monoprint, volcanic eruption, chincolet, and oil stick on monoprint. Now, there's a big jump because I moved from New Mexico to Virginia, and I worked for 4 years in Virginia, where I had a studio at an artist retreat called the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, where I was very privileged to be able to work part-time and also to work on my art. And I brought that art with me when I came to St. Petersburg, because as some of you know, I was in Virginia. I had an artist residency in Southern Indiana, and some friends living in St. Pete said, "Oh, you're so close, you have to come visit." So I said, "Okay, but for no more than 2 weeks." And I'm still here. So in 2013, I had an exhibition, which was basically a little mini retrospective called The East Coast Years, 1996, which is when I moved from New Mexico to St. Petersburg and till 2013. So this was an exhibition at the Mahaffey Theater in St. Petersburg, solo show. I don't want to run through all of these slides individually. You can see them on my website, rosemarieprins.com. So I'm just showing you them as they appeared up on the wall. And so this is one view. And then you'll see the view from the opposite side. The red painting on the right-hand side is called Senti Pensante in red. It's mixed media with stitching. As you'll see, a lot of my work has stitching in it. So if I wound that canvas, then I need to sew it back together, put it back together in some form or other. And with my heritage with family members as seamstresses, then this is something that I tend to do, to sew. And here I would like to acknowledge my mother, who taught me to sew and who also taught me to be, if I'm a good teacher, it's thanks to my mother. So lots of sewing in my work because my mother and my grandmother were seamstresses. So that's the piece, the red one, Senti Pensante in red. And now I'm going to show you at the far end of this wall is another piece, the corresponding piece, Senti Pensante. Let's see, I'm going backwards, sorry. Here we go, Senti Pensante. Also a large piece, about, I don't have the measurements on here, but it's about 5 foot square. And again, with stitching in the middle. That stitching is made with wire. Invariably, it's wire. And mixed media, including tar. I use a lot of tar in my work, and other media like oil stick and acrylics, and sometimes oils. So this is another view of that installation at the Mahaffey, East Coast Years, 1996 to 2013. Now, when I was working on my PhD in Virginia, I got my master's degree when I was living in Los Angeles and working at actually learning, studying at the Women's Building. I got my master's degree in art through Goddard College, but then I went on to Virginia, and there I finished my PhD in studio art, and did a lot of art administration at that time. And so that was a body of work that I created as part of my PhD dissertation. And I still work on it periodically. It's shown in various different parts of the country, but most recently, certainly it showed in Salt Creek Artworks shortly after I arrived here. But most recently, it showed last year at Studio Grand Central, a brand new theater that's opened up in St. Pete. And the owner of the theater knew that I had this body of work, and she knew that it tied in with the inaugural play that they were presenting. And so she asked me to show it again. And so the two pieces here on the wall are from my days in New Mexico. I was working on my PhD. I wanted to make art, but I was in Abiquiu and I didn't have art supplies. So I used that beautiful micaceous soil that's all over New Mexico. And then I adhered it to the paper with acrylic medium, and I found a fire and I found charcoal and used those as my art supplies when I was in Abiquiu, New Mexico. And so those are two pieces. The one on the right is from last year, and it's Untitled Yearning, made with found objects and wire. And this is a view, again, from Studio Grand Central with various pieces from bound crosses and boundary crossings. And you might be wondering why, if you look at some of these pieces, you'll see that, for instance, that piece with the wire has a wire wrapping around the center, like it's wounded, it needs to be fixed, healed. So almost all of my crosses have that same phenomenon of some form of wounding in the center of the cross. I was raised a Christian in South Africa, and it always makes me sad to say this, because this is such a wounded country. And of course, you know, Christianity as it was practiced in South Africa had nothing to do with brotherly love. And so what, to me, I cannot do a cross, portray a cross without that wound in its very center, at its heart, because of my experience growing up in South Africa and witnessing the incredible racism of that country. And thank goodness things have changed there now, or they are changing. So this is bound crosses and boundary crossings. Here we have a close-up of Yearning, Untitled Yearning. Found objects, again, and wire. And this piece is part of bound crosses and boundary crossings, but it wasn't in that show because it's in the permanent collection of Hillsborough Community College. And it's, again, mixed media, including tar and found objects and wire stitching. The entire piece of metal is stitched onto the panel. And so that is bound crosses and boundary crossings. But again, you can see many more of those images on my website, and you can read about it on my blog. So I was living and working in St. Petersburg. And at that time, well, in fact, the entire time I've been here, I've been teaching at the Marian Arts Center as well as other places. And Marian Arts Center had a place at the old pier called Project Creo. And I did the Project Creo, by the way, was great. They only showed installation art. So I showed a couple of installations there. And this was my protest piece. It's called Modern Interior. At that time, his name was James Watts, and he was Secretary of Interior. And he was not an environmentalist. He was the exact opposite. And so this was my piece of rebellion against James Watts and that administration that was destroying our environment as I perceived it. And so this is what I did. Here is Mother Earth turned upside down. She's already partially dismembered, turned upside down in a pot, could be a trash can, with all sorts of society's industrial debris she's in amongst all that debris, and on the floor are these tiles. So, okay, it just looks like any old modern interior, but you get up close and you see these details, which are nothing like what you'd see in your typical modern interior. And those tiles on the floor are actually made from soil, and there are rusted metal objects scattered around on top of the tiles. So that was my protest piece against James Watts and his activities. Now, there's another piece that was also shown at Project Creo. Oh, let me show you that detail, because that is the detail of Mother Earth. And by the way, she's a found object. I found her at Chautauqua, and she was already partially dismembered when I found her. And then moving on, the other installation I showed at Project Creo was Sackcloth and Ashes. And you've all heard of, well, most of you have heard in the Old Testament about how people who were mourning wore sackcloth and ashes, or perhaps they wore sackcloth and ashes because they were lamenting something they had done. They felt regret over something, and so they wore sackcloth and ashes. And so this is the installation I did around that thought of how we should be wearing sackcloth and ashes. We, as human beings who are destroying our planet, should be all wandering around in sackcloth and ashes, smearing our foreheads with ashes and our bodies. But this installation has a smidgen of hope, because that is the phoenix, my version of a phoenix, above a pile of ashes. The ashes on the floor, the phoenix is above it, and in the middle are drawings that I made using ash and medium, acrylic medium, and that was about it. I think there's some charcoal in there on watercolor paper. And that, the phoenix is a mobile, so in fact it spins around the room. There was a fan in the gallery, and so, and of course the air conditioning, so that phoenix spun around the room. And here's a detail of it. And right in the center is found objects, and the very center of it is a found wasp's nest. So that very small little thing in the very center is a wasp's nest. And then we move on to A War Far and Near. I asked a friend, a poet, American poet, Timothy Houghton, to write a poem for me so I could, well, it related to my interest in the Anasazi culture. And so he wrote A War Far and Near, and I had a solo exhibition at Catherine Hickman Theatre in Gulfport, and these are some of the images from that show. These are the images that I created to resonate, not to illustrate, but to resonate to Timothy's poem, A War Far and Near. And I'm going to read, these are words from his poem. Crossing the plains, we slept in this night. There were doors to open, no heads to decorate the poles, unfolding our names, our flags with smoke of battle. Then darkness came as dream, its rivers unsure of their shapes. We thought our tired, dirty faces were its own. We placed our ears against it and heard the sounds of battle. We returned. So in my discussions with Timothy, we talked about how the Anasazi had suddenly disappeared from New Mexico, and he suggested that perhaps there was a war and that was what caused their disappearance. But anyway, I at the time was also very concerned about the wars that the United States was waging in different parts of the world. So this is also, of course, an anti-war piece, as is another of my works that you'll see in a while. And this again is made with soil. This is from Virginia, found at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, where I've had residencies as well as a time when I worked there, and mixed media, including acrylic and oils. And this is the book that I made with Timothy's poem, and it's canvas stained with rust and other natural materials. And it's, for those of you who make books, it's a piano hinge binding. So you'll see at the very top, there's a dowel threaded through that binding. That's called a piano hinge binding, or it's my variation on it. Now, I did have a show at C. Emerson Fine Arts around about 2015, and it was called Lost and Found. And I was playing with these ideas that I have been exploring over the years. And I was not terribly happy with the way that exhibition came out. I figured I would take those ideas later and use them more succinctly, with more impact, which is what I did. But there's one piece that it was in that show that I really do like, and I showed it again at Studio Grand Central recently. So I'll show you that piece. It's called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Right? The show was called Lost and Found, and I was dealing with all the things that are lost and some of the things that have been found. So Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And of course, that's a famous song by, is it Woody Guthrie? Where have all the young men gone, etc. So this is ceramics. Once in a while I sell one of these, so then I have fewer and fewer of them. But anyway, here they are. Then I read a poem by Salah al-Hamdani during the Iraq War, and he was mourning the loss of his homeland. He's an Iraqi poet, and he was from Baghdad, and so his poem was Baghdad Mon Amour. And I was profoundly moved by that poem because it gave me an understanding of what it is to be on the other side of a war. You know, the victors consider themselves victors, but they're also the vanquished, the people who suffer, the women, the children, not only the soldiers. So Homeland Lost and Found was an installation I did as a result of having won Best of Show at the Mauryan Arts Center the previous year. So I was very happy to win Best of Show, but I was also happy to be awarded a solo show at the Mauryan Arts Center the following year. And by the way, that was Catherine Pill of the Museum of Fine Arts. She's a contemporary curator there who gave me the award, so I was very honored. So I created this installation with a lot of help from my friends, Homeland Lost and Found. And the sculpture in the center is one that I made for the previous Lost and Found iteration. And around it are these heads, large and small, made with paper mache. And on it are written some phrases from Salah al-Hamdani's poem. And on the wall behind there are, and there's several of these, you can only see one, but on the wall behind, on beautiful parchment paper, are exquisitely written calligraphy, Salah al-Hamdani's Baghdad Mon Amour. And again, you'll see that calligraphy in the video. I'm losing my voice. And the video was created by Jim Sennett. So you can see some things dangling, there's the shadows, because dangling from the ceiling were rusted metal objects that were put up there by another kind friend. And the video has a soundtrack, and I'm going to see if I can make the soundtrack work. So this is the soundtrack that was created by Rick Neal of Element Dow, and on the video you can see that, and the video is on my website again, but the sound follows the sphere as it arches up into the heavens and then down again. And I just feel this is really evocative of the Middle East. So we have the video, the music, and the walls were painted by some of my Marian Art Center students. And I'm going to move on. And you'd have seen that there was soil on the floor, or sand on the floor, because in most of my installations, there's sand on the floor, because when we walk in that sand, we leave our footprints. And so then we're all implicated by having left our footprints. We're implicated in the wars, we're implicated in environmental devastation. So it means that we have to not only point fingers, but examine our own lives. And so here we have, I'm going to move on. Homeland Lost and Found is a detail, and another detail. And there you see on the screen is some of Charlene McCarthy's gorgeous calligraphy that looks like Arabic writing, but in fact it's in English. And of course, in the video, we have the flames coming up, all the devastation of war, including the fire and the burned out skull of a building, which is what that sculpture represents, casting its shadow onto the video. Around the same time that I exhibited Homeland Lost and Found, I had a solo exhibition at Hillsborough Community College, and that was in Tampa. It's called Sanctuary. When I first came to Florida, I fell in love with the Florida Springs. One of my favorite activities, and I haven't done this for a while, but one of my favorite activities was to go to Juniper Springs and go camping and swim in that ice cold water. And this was just heaven for me. And then more recently, I learned that those springs were at risk. The pristine water was being polluted. They were being depleted, are being depleted. And so I started doing further investigation on what had been, those places had been a sanctuary for me, these freshwater springs of Florida. And so I created Sanctuary. This is an early preparatory drawing, so the end result looks nothing like this, in fact. But then I had a working title, Silver Spring Swan Song. And of course, you saw that woman, the Earth Mother, with her head in the trash can in a previous installation. I was exploring that idea, but anyway, we moved on from there. And so one of the things I did plan for this installation was paintings on the background, large paintings, blue ones to replicate water or the feeling of water. And so I made, in fact, 4 paintings for this installation. Here's one of them, Like Water, 61 by 37, Flight, again, all the same size, Sanctuary, and then Darkness Came. And here's a detail of the installation at HCC in the Dale Mabry campus. And then those moths, I brought out more of those moths to dangle around, not a candle, but this time it was a tree that was looking very, very dead. So several of these moths, they're all mobiles, different from the ones you saw before. And here they are in the installation. The paintings are on the wall in the background. There's sand on the floor, and in the middle is a very dead looking tree with, instead of leaves this time, it has rusted metal objects dangling from its branches. And there were rusted metal branch objects on the floor. And there was a soundtrack of running water the entire time that the installation was up. It was on a loop, so the water was running. Beautiful, peaceful water. So it was, this piece was not only about the devastation of the springs, but it was a voice of hope saying, yes, we can restore our springs, we can do something about it. And it was wonderful to read the responses of the students at Hillsborough Community College who were invited to write in a book that I had on a bench about their feelings about the installation and about the devastation of the springs. And some of them wrote very moving, inspiring statements. And here we have a detail from that installation. And this is a brochure with its insert. In 2016, I received a grant from Creative Pinellas, a professional artist grant, for which I was incredibly grateful, because that 2016 was a very hard year for me. And so early in 2016, I learned about the grant, and I decided I had always wanted to go to India. So I was going to use the grant money to go to an artist retreat in India. I might not have mentioned this, but I've been to many artist retreats, or not many, but several, spent a lot of time at artist retreats. And so I was able to go to India and work at the Sanskriti Kendra, an artist retreat there. My plan was to work on the same issue that I was working with when I made the piece about the springs, about not their natural springs, but about their natural bodies of water, the Yamuna and Ganges rivers, and how polluted they have become over the years. And that was going to be my project for India. But when I got there, and I'll show you more images of that later, I changed my mind. So here we have another iteration of what you saw in Sanctuary at HCC. Here we have another dead tree. Those panels are mylar in the background. They were also at HCC. And of course, the moth-like objects. But on the right are the works that I brought back with me from India that had been inspired by what I found and what I saw there. And they're just small works on paper. There they are. What happened was my 23 tubes of oil paint were confiscated en route from the United States to India. And so I had no paint to work with. So I took the soil, the beautiful, beautiful golden soil on the grounds of Sanskriti, sifted it, and used that as my art material. I had to take a taxi to the market to buy some acrylic medium so I could adhere the soil to the paper. It was Indian handmade paper. And then I picked the beautiful leaves on these trees that were just so amazing. They survived the smog, they survived the drought, and they were so beautifully tended. So I picked the leaves and I laid them on the paper and I traced around them and made these 18 pieces. A leaf in the wind. And here we have one of the paintings. I did several paintings for that installation, and you'll find them on my website. But this is Meditation on Oceans and Rivers. And here is a view of the other side of this exhibition that was at the studio at 620 in 2017. And throughout my career, as I have mentioned, I've used soil. So I'm going to show you some of the pieces that I've incorporated soil, and they're in various of these different exhibitions they've been shown. But there's also a series called Terra Firma, terra being earth. This is one that I worked on in Virginia when I was working on my PhD. I didn't have much time to make art, so I took a huge piece of canvas, stuck it under the house, and let nature do its thing. And when I pulled it out, it had done its thing and had this beautiful texture and surface. And then I used tar and charcoal to turn it into sacred earth. And this is just a detail of this very, very long canvas. And the piece that won Best of Show in 2013 is Body, Mind, and Soul. It's a triptych, 5 inch, each panel is only 5 inches square. So this is body, mind, and soul. And this piece I made in Virginia using the micaceous, not Virginia, in New Mexico, using the micaceous clay there. And it's a collage, this is a detail of it, a collage on a panel. And this is using the soil at Chautauqua. I was director at the Chautauqua Center for the Visual Arts for a couple of years in the summertime, and I used the soil there to make art. So this is a small, I did numerous of these, many of them. In fact, you saw them on the floor in a piece called Modern Interior, but this is one that I particularly liked. Where have all the soldiers gone? And again, it's a wounded cross with a little piece of collage element right in the center. And this is a very large piece made with soil from Georgia, adhered to the canvas with acrylic medium and blue acrylic paint. More recently, I've been making works with sandstone that somebody has very kindly given to me. And so this is a piece that showed here recently at the Mauryan Arts Center in the beginning. And what you see at the base of this sculpture is hot type, antique hot type in a frame. Right now we use digital type, cold type, but those days it was made with lead. This is in the beginning. Another piece recent is Filipino Raindancer. And that is actually soil from the Filipinos. I've never been there, but somebody brought it for me, gave it to me, and a Chevy hubcap and found objects. And this is Filipino Raindancer. And here is a detail of the head of Filipino Raindancer. I call it a head. Usually I work non-representationally, but some of these things do look like they have personalities. And this is Coral's Last Dance. It's currently in the exhibition that opened yesterday, I believe, at Dunedin Fine Arts Center. It's a tiny piece made with coral, of course, and then found objects. And that's part of Small is Beautiful. It's an international miniature exhibition, international exhibition of miniature art. And then throughout the years, I've made artist books, and I'll just whiz through these, but again, you can find them on my website. I've always been interested in reading and books. And so here we have artist books. This was inspired one of my artist books. It's actually the Sun Dagger at Chaco Canyon. I was lucky enough to climb up El Fajado Butte and see that happen right in midsummer. I saw the Sun Dagger move slowly down the spiral that had been carved into the rock eons ago, and it was quite magical. So that inspired a book called Shadow's Clock, playing with the notion of Jungian shadow. We project onto others what we don't want to own in ourselves. And so here's the book with the dagger shape, and you open it up and you find the spiral that was carved into that rock surface. And then I did performances at summer solstice and winter solstice. This is, of course, is the summer one because I was in New Mexico, cold. And here I am creating a shadow with a makeshift primitive clock. And then the winter performance is here, the shadow created by the snow and the sun. And this was, again, a protest piece against war, war machine for a banana republic. The United States was at war again. And these are rusted saw blades. And you can see on the little inset on the right, that is the cover of the book made with banana plant bark. And it folds up. And the title is written on a ceramic ball. And this is a piece I made inspired by Louise Erdrich's poem, Captivity. I'm a lover of all her writing, and I loved this poem. It was really moving. And so this is a poem, a piece I did, an artist book in a fur-lined antique animal crate, and it's an accordion fold book. And there's just one page, that's the last page inset on the right, and two more pages. After that, the birds mocked, shadows gaped and roared. Oh, her writing is just beautiful. Pages from Captivity. And of course, the whole poem is in that box. Then something I didn't mention, because it's hard for me to mention, is in 2016, my son passed away very suddenly. And so that's why it was such a blessing for me to be able to go to India and to travel in all the places I have traveled since he passed away, because travel has certainly helped me to deal with my grief. And that trip to India was very, very healing for me. So A Leaf in the Wind is inspired by my trip to India. This is what I saw when I first arrived in India, this great big tree, banyan tree, I believe is banyan, yep. And of course, it was absolutely hidden in smog earlier in the morning, but it was so beautiful. And more scenes of Sanskriti Kendra, again, shrouded in smog. And another scene of one of the trees shrouded in smog. But those trees were so valiant. They survived in spite of the smog. They survived in spite of the drought. And the workers on the grounds tended them so beautifully. And they had such beautiful titles: Krishna's Buttercup, Frangipani of the Temple, Devil's Tree. And so I kind of gave up on my initial plan to work on the polluted waters of India, Yamuna, Ganges. And I did the series that I showed you earlier with the soil, using that golden soil. And then, of course, this is the market where I had to go to buy my acrylic medium to adhere the soil. Very colorful. But on the way there, on the taxi drive there, I saw a lot of poverty, people living on the medians, on the roads, actually setting up camp on them. So India is beautiful. It has beautiful spiritual practices, and also, of course, we know terrible poverty. So this was a colorful market. This is my studio at the Sanskriti Kendra with works in progress, experimental works, the Indian handmade paper with the soil, and some of the leaves have been painted by placing the leaves onto the paper and then tracing around them and painting into them. This was my therapy for years. I painted those leaves ad nauseum because it was all I could do in the art making realm for quite a long time. And this was one of those experiments. And this is one of the pieces that I ended up I saved and this is Tree of Sadness and Whistling Pine, Lotus, Queen's Flower, Kadamba, Cinnamon, Indian Laburnum, Devil's Tree, Frangipani of the Temple, Krishna's Buttercup, Mango. And then I made, when I came back from India sometime later, I did some printmaking, making echo prints with the actual leaves from India, which I had pressed and brought back with me. So this was done here at Namarian using paint to emulate the color of the soil. Ink to emulate this color of the soil. For the printmakers out there, that was a boo-boo. Ink and an echo print, actually dipping the actual leaf into the ink and then placing it on the paper and running it through the press. So I did several of those. I'm showing you a few examples. The others are on my website. This is another series of prints I did, collagraphs with watercolor, again, done here at the Marian on their press, using the actual leaves again, as well as cutout of the leaves. And I did numerous ones of those too. And here we have the Taj Mahal, because, as I mentioned before, it was the color of India that really was inspirational and healing for me too. I never worked with color, but I suddenly started to in my grief. I started working with color. And of course, if you go to India, you have to go to the Taj Mahal. And the day before I left, I went to the Taj Mahal and got to see that in all its amazing majesty as the smog lifted and the sun shone, and it was beautiful. And here is an interior of the Taj Mahal, interior view of the tiles particularly. So those tiles I took with me to Mexico when I went to an artist retreat. And I'm actually out of time, so I'm going to zip through this. At Casa Buena, I worked with lots of color, and again with those Indian leaves, weaving them and doing watercolors and collaging and inking around those same leaves to create these backgrounds. And I did 22 of these, sometimes echo prints using the actual leaf, sometimes adding dried fern to them to give them some dimension, like that one, let's see, that one has it, the mango. And this is a teak leaf, again, an echo print. And this is a book using the color, well, those again, yeah, the collagraphs and echo prints. And it's a book with a poem written by my son. He was a poet and he wrote some beautiful poetry. And this is one of his poems he wrote for a friend of his on her birthday, As Each Moon Passes. And this was shown very recently at the Warehouse Arts District. It just came back last week. And here it is, as each moon passes, you get wiser, etc., etc. And that's the beginning of the book. And that's the end of the book, written by Jaro Majer, 1975 to 2016. And now I have started taking those actual leaves that I brought back from India, 2017, early 2017, and now I'm gluing them on, adhering them onto canvas, so I can't trace around them anymore. They're stuck on canvases and paper and various other surfaces with mixed media backgrounds. And this is Belleric Miro Balan. And that piece is behind me. You might be able to see it over there. And then what did I do with all of these images that on watercolor with Indian leaves? I wrote a book. No, I only wrote the forward and the afterward. My son wrote the book. These are all his poems in this book, 21 of his poems. And they're beautiful, deeply spiritual poems. And I see I'm losing it. So I need to take a moment to catch my breath. I have one more slide to show.
Okay,
So
I'm gonna let you go back.
Book, and this is the actual book, which is available on my website and at the Maureen Arts Center with my son's beautiful poems. And here I am reading a poem from that book. And behind me is a painting entitled, and it's made with Indian leaves, again, with American soil. And it's entitled, He is Free, Tumbling Like a Leaf in the Wind, From Life to Life. And there am I reading from the book. And I'm going to take 1 minute to read a very short poem from the book. It's called Similes. And it's from an email my son sent me. Jaro Majer is his name. He sent me on Thursday, June 17th, 2004. Love, like spring blossoms, grows singing. Like summer sun illumines. Like autumn trees colors. Like winter's purity pervades. Like seasons turning changes. Love, ever the altar to which I bow.